Beyond the Bony Labyrinths. Podcast on music and philosophy by Loreley S. Episode 22: Music as Fiction. A recurrent theme in this series is the relationship between music and language. That has, of course, many aspects. One of these is grammar, the formal structure of language and music. Another aspect is that of the concrete utterance or speech act, the great variety of things we do with language. Exchanging information, screaming bloody murder, talking nonsense, arguing, and so on. For many centuries that was the domain of rhetoric. But rhetoric's concern was above all the skill in one manner of speaking, a solistic discourse, aimed at conveying a message in a convincing manner. Precisely what I'm trying to do at this moment. Something else we can do with language is telling stories. A story can be true or untrue, and the latter, I think, is more characteristic for what we call a story. In the case of true stories, we rather speak of reporting or chronicling. Typically, a story is more of a made-up tale, and we don't call this untrue, but fiction. This takes us into the realm not of rhetoric, but of classical poetics, or what is nowadays literary theory and narratology. A story, or narrative, is a series of events that is told about in a coherent manner. It is also possible that these events are not told about, but shown, enacted, and that is the case in stage drama, film and television drama, and so on. The story of Nabokov's Lolita and Kubrick's film version is very roughly the same. The way in which it is presented is radically different. The question I want to raise is what music, or at least some music, has in common with fiction, and whether it can even be a form of fiction. And next, whether it is more similar to narrative fiction or dramatic fiction. Let me begin, without further explanation, with a short Prélude by Debussy. The Prélude has a title, but Debussy did not put it above the piece, but as with all his other Prélude, under it. And the title is La sérénade interrompue, the interrupted serenade. That unusual placement, with 3 dots that precede it, gives the title the appearance of something like an afterthought, an interpretation that one may give afterwards. For the listener and pianist it is maybe a hint. First figure it out for yourself what this piece might represent. The title, La sérénade interrompue, is exceptional in the 2 volumes of Debussy's Prélude because it does not refer to a situation or a character, but to an incident, an event. And this implies a very short story. Somebody performs a serenade, and that serenade is interrupted. With sufficient knowledge of the musical context, the listener could maybe figure that out even without the title. At least there are a few recognizable stereotypical features that point towards it. First of all, there is the Spanish, Andalusian flavor that provides a common setting for serenade scenes. The imitation of guitar playing and singing, with in the melody a hint of cantajondo, flamenco singing. Debussy has included a number of performance instructions in the score that also clarify the story. As if improvising a prelude, he writes under the first bars. A bit pleading. In the distance, furious as a reaction to that distant music, and finally, softly and harmoniously, where the music flourishes for the last time. But what makes all this into a series of events is above all the interruptions. Those brutal chords leave it to the listener to guess what is happening here. Maybe a window being slammed shut, or a flower pot that almost hits the singer on the head. The second interruption, in the distance, seems to represent a different music, a band that comes marching around the corner, and which the singer-guitarist tries to compete with furiously and apparently successfully. The story that you can construct from these elements is not a story that is told, but a story or a series of events that is shown, represented in music, a kind of audio play, like the soundtrack to a silent film, but without the film. The events are represented mainly with piano music that represents other similar music, and represents the act of making music, playing the guitar and singing, and a marching band. Music representing music, what you could call meta-music, the topic of episode 5. Maybe we cannot interpret every detail as an element in the story. That is not unusual in music, rather the rule, and listeners often accept that without thinking, as long as the inner musical logic, the structural coherence, is intact. Of course, in this prelude, it is not during the interruptions, which are therefore the most obvious narrative or dramatic element, something that is unaccountable at the level of structure. They are real musical interruptions that at a story level represent fictional interruptions. What this prelude shows, or lets us hear, is that music can have the structure of a story, a coherent series of events. A plot without words, as in a silent movie or a textless comic book. That is not what usually counts as the primary function of music, and sometimes it is considered alien to music, as something music ought not to do. Nevertheless, there is a centuries-old tradition of program music, instrumental music, when music without lyrics, that we can interpret as the musical realization of a scenario. The genre reached its peak in the 19th century with what is known in German as Sinfonische Dichtung, usually translated as symphonic poem, but Dichtung has a broader meaning, and a better translation might be symphonic fiction. Musicologists have often made a misleading, overly simplistic distinction between program music and so-called absolute or abstract music. I discussed this in episode 19. Music can have representational qualities or a storyline without all the details being specifically identifiable and without an explicit program that is attached to it. Debussy's Prélude is a rather unambiguous example of music in which we can recognize a scenario, just like we can follow the scenario of a silent movie, except that the medium is not visual but auditory. The scenario or story remains implicit. There is no story in the sense of a narrative, a story being told. As I understand the term, but there is disagreement about that, narrative implies narration, the act of narrating or telling. Can music tell a story? In the strict sense, evidently it cannot. Narrating is something we do with language, and music is not language or a language. It does not have the semantics that allows us to say something like, "Once upon a time there was a poor woodcutter." But telling, narrating, is as a linguistic act, an act, and what music can do, maybe to some extent, is suggest or represent a narrative attitude. To answer that question, I want to discuss a second example. This is the case of a song that has been arranged for a piano solo. The text is so well known that many listeners may have it in mind even when there is no singer to sing the words. What I'm talking about is Die Loreley, after the poem by Heinrich Heine in the composition of Franz Liszt. The poem is following the composer's instruction printed in the piano score. But the text is not made audible. The song is transformed into program music. Even if we would ignore the poem, there are features of the music that suggest a plot, a storyline. Most conspicuously, this is the calamity that we hear in the middle of the piece, and it may be fairly obvious to think of a shipwreck, although an unsuspecting listener might initially think of the sound of hooves. But what follows strongly suggests being sucked down into a swirling stream. This contrasts with the calm rippling movement before it, a flowing river. The story told is the legend of the Loreley, a nymph who sits on a rocky outcrop above the Rhine, and with her enchanting song lures passing sailors to their doom. But that poem is not just a retelling of that story. It is not a ballade, a narrative poem, like Goethe's Erlkönig, for instance, is a ballade. The narrative is placed in a framework, an introduction and an epilogue. The opening lines are almost too well known to quote. Ich weiß nicht, was soll es bedeuten, dass ich so traurig bin. Ein Märchen aus uralten Zeiten, das kommt mir nicht aus dem Sinn. I don't know what it means that I'm so sad. A fairy tale from ancient times keeps haunting my thoughts. The legend is, in fact, not ancient at all. Its origin goes back no further than one generation. The folk tale is a recent pseudo-folk tale, and perhaps the poet was well aware of it. In the poem's introduction, the story is represented as something that surfaces in memory. The actual narrative is thus embedded in lyrical reflection, the thoughts of a poetic subject, a first-person I. I don't know what it means that I am so sad. Something of this poetic form, narration embedded in reflection, actual narration to oneself, a resurfacing from memory, we can recognize in the music. The composition begins with a piano introduction in both the original song and the arrangement, but with a melody that suggests a violoncello. This indicates the mood, dass ich so traurig bin, before the first word of the text. Those first lines of the text are set as a recitative, recognizable also in the piano solo version as recitative, a declamatory manner of singing. When on those notes the words are sung, dass ich so traurig bin, the text acquires a rather tearful expression with a misplaced stress on ich. It is one of the reasons I think the piano solo version is more successful than the original song. The lyrical introduction is followed by 4 lines of text describing a landscape. It is cool and dusk is falling. The Rhine flows calmly. We see the mountain peak sparkling in the sunset. This bridges the contrast between personal lyrical reflection and narrative, the actual story of the Loreley. At this point, Liszt introduces a gently rocking 9/8 time signature, which simultaneously depicts the calmly flowing Rhine and evokes the nostalgic mood we tend to associate with fairy tales and legends. The same elements, recitative and rocking rhythm, recur extensively in the epilogue after the shipwreck. The poem has for that only a brief observation, and that is what the Loreley did with her singing. A brief, perhaps laconic observation that leaves open the question of what the moral of the story is, if any at all. What Liszt made out of this is an extensive recapitulation of the recitative with far too many notes for the words, which forces him to repeat some words, a practice that is customary in opera, but does not really suit this song. Und das hat mit ihrem Singen die Loreley getan. Und das hat mit ihrem Singen die Loreley getan. Die Loreley getan. Und das hat mit ihrem Singen, and so on. This won't bother you if you listen to the piano version. The music has said goodbye to the poem and sustains the mood, revels in it, while in the poem that mood is actually kept at a critical distance. Telling a story is something we can only do with words, but I think that a specific narrative tone can be recognized in music, regardless of the words or lack of them. In spoken storytelling, too, we can often recognize something like a narrative tone. The words, once upon a time, are a formula that immediately lets us know what kind of story to expect. A story that has little to do with historical truth or probability. Those words immediately evoke a certain atmosphere, and that includes a certain tone of voice, a typical fairy tale tone that evokes a particular feeling. Pull your chair a little closer and let your imagination run free. But beware, it can get scary. In an earlier episode, I talked about Schumann's Fantasie. It contains a passage with the unusual instructions im Legendentone, in the manner of legends. In an earlier version it was erzählend im Legendenton, narrating in the legendary manner. You might wonder why Schumann erased precisely that word erzählend, perhaps to avoid the question, what is being narrated? But the tone, or manner, and the legend are still there, and clues to what this means are found in the monotonous recitation and the somewhat formulaic repetitions of the short melodic phrases, albeit with some variation and with increasing rhythmic activity. Schumann initially titled this passage Romanza. In those days, the term Romanze was often interchangeable with ballade, referring to a poem or simple song with narrative content and a strophic form. A feature of ballades, not the same thing as a ballad in English, a characteristic feature is that they're usually written in 6/8 time, with a characteristic long, short rhythm. Typical of this is the most popular setting of Heine's Loreley poem by a certain Friedrich Silcher. In that tune, the poem is reduced to a simple pseudo-folk song. That is precisely the opposite of what Liszt did. He magnified the dramatic elements. But Liszt does make use of the balladentone, the lulling rhythm that can evoke a nostalgic, pleasant mood, a calm narrative tone that contrasts with the dramatic recitative that precedes it. These are two clearly different ways of speaking, two types of speech act. For this, Liszt uses a 9/8 time signature. But in the first version of the song, he uses 6/8 with the significant instruction im Balladentone. The effect is somewhat breathless, and the later version seems in every respect to be a more effective realization of something the composer had attempted to do some 20 years earlier. One could argue that the musical qualities of this music do evoke a certain mood, without, however, producing a recognizable narrative tone. Apart from the text, it could just as well be a lyrical reflection. That may be true, and I therefore do not think we can speak here of a narrative tone without taking into account the conventions of the genre of the ballade. The long, short rhythm is a conventional, rather than an essential feature of a narrative tone. A bit like the stereotypical opening words, once upon a time, a signal that we are dealing with the genre of the fairy tale. With some knowledge of the conventions of the genre of the ballade, one may understand why Chopin gave his 4 ballades for piano that title, even though the complexity and virtuosity of these pieces far exceeds the traditional simplicity of the vocal ballade. All 4 are written in 6/8 or 6/4 time signature, and the justification of the title is just as much in that narrative tone or manner as in the story or scenario that you might find in the music, but for which Chopin gives us no clue at all. This is the beginning of Ballade No. 4. Chopin's ballades are a transformation of a genre that for a full understanding requires some knowledge of the model, the simple vocal ballade. What Chopin's ballades represent is not so much a story as the act of telling a story, in the form of the vocal ballade. A vocal ballade that Chopin is very likely to have known is that in Fra Diavolo by Auber, an opera comique about a bandit. It is still known to a wider audience thanks to a film version starring Laurel and Hardy, the Devil's Brother. This ballade, titled Romance in the score, serves to introduce the character of Fra Diavolo, Friar Devil. If you keep these exclamations in mind, tremblez, tremblez, shiver. In the midst of the storm, the echo repeats, Diavolo, Diavolo, Diavolo. And if you then listen to Chopin's Ballade No. 3, you may recognize in the loud sforzato chords a similar exclamation, a similar rhetoric, but with much greater subtlety. There is a difference between a story that is shown, dramatically represented, and a story that is told. Music cannot literally tell a story, but it can have a narrative tone or manner. Now, narrating a story is an action, and that action, any action, implies someone acting. Perhaps without a name or recognizable identity, but nonetheless a presence that manifests itself in the act of telling and in the manner in which it is done, choice of words, tone, and a perspective offered on what is happening in the story, what is told, what is omitted. The literary narrator or the speaking voice of a poem is a character that belongs to the fictional world. The first person I in the poem Die Loreley shares its thoughts and memories, that maybe are also those of the poet Heine, or maybe not. For the reader, that is of no importance. Every text is the representation of a speech act. That is something we can often ignore, but it becomes more apparent when the text is read aloud, when somebody lends the text her voice. Something done much more often in past centuries than it is today. A declaimer who would recite Die Loreley in the days of Heine and Liszt would not do so impassively in a neutral tone. He would empathize, perhaps even as if he were witnessing the event himself. In that act, the declaimer takes the role of the narrator, a fictional character. That is precisely what Liszt's music does, and does with dramatic exaggeration. The musical excitement at the moment of the shipwreck is almost like a live report of a soccer game. The poem itself suggests a more detached tone. In the following lines, the narrator immediately takes his distance from the event. Ich glaube, die Wellen verschlingen am Ende Schiffer und Kahn. I believe that in the end the waves swallow up the boatman and his boat. With those words, I believe, the perspective is switched back to the first person. We are reminded of the fact that it is just a story that has stuck in memory. The final lines, and that is what Loreley did with her singing. And those suggest a hint of mocking relativism. Yeah, those silly old fairy tales. The pianist is here in the same position as the declaimer. He or she gives audible form to the role of the narrator, and that is contained in the notes, and must make choices about how to give form to that role. In a ballade, the narrator is not a participant in the events, and normally, unlike in Heine's Loreley, not present as a first-person character. In music there are, of course, no personal pronouns. But you can hear the difference between a story that is told in a lively manner and personal experience, within a third-person perspective and a first-person perspective. That is the question. It is an interesting question, though. For Chopin's ballades, it can make a difference whether we interpret them as confessions, as poetic self-expression, or whether we assume the role of a more detached narrator who tells the story in an imaginative way, but does not play a role in it himself. This was episode 22 of Beyond the Bony Labyrinths.